From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
30 years ago, I wrote the first book on climate change. Back then, it was a distant, abstract threat. Now we're at the point where it is the lived reality for millions of people every single day, the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, and the biggest fight that we have on our hands.
Falter. Has the human game begun to play itself out? As Democrats push the Green New Deal, we speak to Bill McKibben about his new book in the fight to combat climate change. Then we go to Indonesia. Ahead of Wednesday's election, we'll speak to investigative reporter Alan Nairn about his shocking new report on how one of the leading candidates, Prabowo Subianto, has plans to stage mass arrests of political opponents and his current allies if he wins, and to restore Indonesia's army to the role it played during the Suharto dictatorship. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. One day after reports emerged that White House officials had pressured immigration authorities to release immigrant detainees into sanctuary cities, President Trump confirmed the shocking proposal, first via tweet. Later, he spoke to reporters.
We'll bring the illegal, really you call them the illegals. I call them the illegals. They came across the border illegally. We'll bring them to sanctuary city areas and let that particular area take care of it, whether it's a state or whatever it might be.
Trump made the remarks at a White House event Friday, saying he could enact the plan if Democrats don't accept his immigration proposals. Trump has long railed against sanctuary cities, which have barred local police from cooperating with federal immigration agencies like ICE. Democratic Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan responded to Trump in an op-ed saying, "Seattle is not afraid of immigrants and refugees. What does it scare us? A president and federal government that would seek to weaponize a law enforcement agency to punish perceived political enemies. This president believes that immigrants and refugees burden our country and burden cities like ours, but he could not be more wrong," she said. The New York Daily News published a defiant front-page cover with the headline, "We'll Take Them," on Saturday, featuring a photo of the Statue of Liberty with the words, "Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Minnesota freshman Congress member Ilhan Omar says she's received a spike in death threats since President Trump tweeted a video juxtaposing her image with footage of the 9/11 attacks. Trump posted the 43-second video Friday with the caption, "We will never forget." Trump's tweet intercut video of the World Trade Center towers burning with video of Omar speaking about the increasing attacks on the Muslim American community after 9/11. Omar was speaking at a Council on American-Islamic Relations event last month.
Far too long, we have lived with the discomfort of being a second-class citizen. And frankly, I'm tired of it, and every single Muslim in this country should be tired of it. CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.
Congressmember Omar's comments were originally taken out of context and circulated by right-wing media, from the Daily Caller to Fox News. In a statement, Congressmember Omar said, quote, "Since the president's tweet Friday evening, I've experienced an increase in direct threats on my life, many directly referencing or replying to the president's video. This is endangering lives. It has to stop," she said. In New York City, Yemeni bodega owners responded to Trump's attacks against Congressmember Ilhan Omar by announcing they're boycotting the sale and purchase of the New York Post over its front-page attack on Omar. The Murdoch-owned daily paper featured an image of the burning Twin Towers on 9/11, referencing Omar's comment out of context. 9/11 was "some people did something," and the words "here's your something" in large print over the photo. The Yemeni American Merchants Association said the cover provoked hatred and targeted people of the Muslim faith. The International Criminal Court announced Friday it was refusing to pursue an investigation into possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the United States and other actors in Afghanistan. The court suggested the U.S.'s lack of cooperation with the investigations behind the decision. Earlier this month, the U.S. revoked the visa of ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, who asked ICC judges to authorize the investigation in 2017. Human rights groups condemned the decision. Catherine Gallagher of the Center for Constitutional Rights said the ICC was bowing to President Trump's pressure campaign and that, quote, with its decision, the International Criminal Court sends a dangerous message that bullying wins and that the powerful won't be held to account. In Sudan, the head of the newly installed military council resigned Friday, just one day after he was sworn in following the ouster of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. The ouster came after months of public protests demanding al-Bashir's resignation. The military's chief of staff also stepped down from his post on Friday. Protesters celebrated the news and mounted calls for the creation of a civilian transitional council, rejecting the military's proposal to lead a two-year pre-election transition period. Meanwhile, the United Nations has called on Sudanese authorities to release anyone arrested for demonstrating against the government. It also called on Sudan to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, which issued an arrest warrant in 2005 for the ousted leader al-Bashir over possible war crimes. Sudan's military council said they will not hand over al-Bashir to the ICC, but instead will put him on trial in Sudan with other former leaders. Local reports emerged Monday that other top officials from al-Bashir's government were arrested by the military council and could also face prosecution. In Algeria, police arrested over 100 protesters as thousands continued to take to the streets Friday, less than 2 weeks after the resignation of four-term President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Demonstrators are calling for the removal of interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah and the entire ruling elite that's been in power in Algeria since the country gained independence in 1962. This is a protester speaking from the capital, Algiers.
In Algeria, we are seeing a soft military coup. In Sudan, there was a direct military coup. There is no difference between us and Sudan. We are witnessing a process of manipulation.
Protesters say they'll continue to demonstrate until a democratic civilian transition takes place. Interim President Ben Salah has said elections will take place in Algeria in July. The UN reported Sunday at least 120 people have been killed in Libya over the past week and a half as fighting intensifies between General Haftar's Eastern Libyan National Army and the UN-backed Government of National Accord. On Sunday, Haftar met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who threw his support behind the renegade general and his Libyan National Army forces as they continue their offensive on the capital, Tripoli. The UN warned outbreaks of infectious diseases could spread quickly as more people flee the fighting, and that it only has about 2 weeks of emergency supplies for hospitals and health facilities. Human rights groups are also sounding the alarm over the safety of the many migrants and refugees who pass through Libya, thousands of whom are currently in migrant prisons. Libyans have taken to the streets to protest the escalating violence.
We're here today in a protest against military rule, against the war criminal Khalifa Haftar, the retired Sir Chud. No to military rule, yes to democracy, yes to elections, yes to peaceful resolution, and praise be to Allah.
In Gaza, Israeli soldiers shot and killed a 15-year-old Palestinian teenager Friday during the weekly protest at the separation barrier with Israel. The killing comes 2 weeks after Palestinians marked the first anniversary of the Great March of Return and is the first fatality in the second year of the ongoing demonstration, according to Palestinian health officials. In Pakistan, a suicide bomb in the northern city of Quetta in Baluchistan province killed or reported 24 people, injured dozens more Friday. The militant group Lashkar-e-Jhangvi is believed to be responsible for the attack, which targeted the Hazara Shia Muslim minority. Since Friday's attack, members of the Hazara community have been protesting the government's failure to prevent violent attacks in the region. In South Korea, a decades-old ban on abortions has been lifted after years of campaigning and legal battles against the law, which included possible prison sentences for doctors who perform abortions and fines or prison sentences for anyone who underwent the procedure. South Korean activists celebrated as the news was announced outside a courthouse in the capital, Seoul.
My friend had to use illegal drugs for a risky abortion because of the abortion law. I also wouldn't have had much of a choice if I had become pregnant. But with today's ruling, women like myself and my friend can live by our own free will.
In more reproductive rights news, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine signed into law the draconian so-called fetal heartbeat bill, which bans abortions once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, something that typically happens just 6 weeks into a pregnancy and before many women realize they're pregnant. The bill does not include exceptions for cases of rape or incest. A similar law is set to take effect in Mississippi in July, while judges have, for now, blocked fetal heartbeat bills from going into effect in Kentucky and Iowa. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp is expected to sign Georgia's abortion ban in coming weeks. The ACLU said it would challenge Ohio's new law in court. The nonprofit Guttmacher Institute warns that various types of legislation to ban abortion are currently being considered in 28 states. House Democrats set a new deadline of April 23rd for the IRS to hand over Trump's tax returns after the agency failed to meet the original deadline set for last week. Democrats are asking for 6 years of Trump's tax records. The House Ways and Means Committee Chair, Richard Neal, said the IRS and the Treasury Department were not legally empowered to refuse the committee's request. Neal could follow up a second failure to meet the request with a subpoena or file a lawsuit. And in South Bend, Indiana, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who officially launched his campaign for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, at a rally in his hometown, the 37-year-old Afghanistan war veteran stressed the urgency to act now to correct the policies of President Trump.
The principles that will guide my campaign for president are simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker: freedom, security, and democracy.
Pete Buttigieg supports progressive Democratic positions, including the Green New Deal, the legalization of marijuana, and a single-payer health care, although he does not support doing away with private insurance. Buttigieg has also been vocal in his support for Israel, praising its national security measures as a model for other countries and suggesting some Democrats are too quick to judge Israel based on media reports. He made the comments after a trip to Israel last year amidst ongoing protests at the separation barrier in Gaza, which have resulted in at least 200 deaths and tens of thousands of injured. If elected president, Buttigieg would become the youngest U.S. president, as well as the first openly gay president. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Thousands are taking to the streets in London today to demand radical action to combat the climate crisis. Protesters with the group Extinction Rebellion have set up encampments and roadblocks across central London and say they'll stay in the streets for at least a week. It's just the beginning of a series of global actions that'll unfold in the coming days as activists around the world raise the alarm about government inaction in the face of the growing climate catastrophe. A spokesperson with Extinction Rebellion told The Guardian governments prioritize the short-term interests of the economic elites, so to get their attention, we have to disrupt the economy, they said. The London protests come just days after school children around the globe left school again on Friday for the weekly Strike for Climate. The movement was started last year when, at the time, 15-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg stood alone outside the Swedish parliament to demand her government do more to combat climate change. Now, kids around the globe have answered her call with their own weekly strikes. The esteemed journal Science published an open letter from scientists supporting the global youth protests last week. It reads in part, quote, "As scientists and scholars who've recently initiated similar letters of support in our countries, we call for our colleagues across all disciplines and from the entire world to support these young climate protesters. We declare their concerns are justified and supported by the best available science. The current measures for protecting the climate and biosphere are deeply inadequate," Science wrote. This all comes as the push for the Green New Deal continues to build momentum in the United States. The deal, backed by Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, seeks to transform the U.S. economy through funding renewable energy while ending U.S. carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted last week, "The far right loves to drum up fear and resistance to immigrants. But have you ever noticed they never talk about what's causing people to flee their homes in the first place? Perhaps that's because they'd be forced to confront one major factor fueling global migration, climate change," she wrote. We turn now to a climate activist and journalist who's been on the front lines of the fight for the planet for decades. 30 years ago, in 1989, Bill McKibben wrote The End of Nature, the first book about climate change for a general audience. He's just published a new book. It's titled Falter: Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? Bill McKibben joins us here in our New York studio. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Bill.
It's always good to be with you.
Falter: Has the human game begun to play itself out?
You know, 30 years ago when I started writing about this, it was a distant threat. We were issuing a warning. Scientists knew that as we burned coal and gas and oil, we were putting carbon in the atmosphere. They knew the molecular structure of CO2 trapped heat. We didn't know how fast and how hard it was going to pinch. The story of the last 30 years, or one of the stories of the last 30 years, is that it pinched a hell of a lot harder and faster than even we feared. The things we're seeing now, half the sea ice in the summer Arctic gone, the ocean 30% more acidic, half the coral reefs under siege. These were things we thought would happen 50, 60, 70 years from now, but the planet turned out to be very finely balanced. So that was one of the surprises of those 30 years. The other surprise was how little reaction there was in our political system, how slowly it's moved. In essence, we've done almost nothing as a world to grapple with the biggest problem that we've ever wandered into. The two pieces of really good news are, one, that the engineers have done their job just about as well as the politicians have done theirs badly. The price of a solar panel has dropped 90%. We have the technology in a way that we didn't even a decade ago to know where we could turn if we wanted to. And we've seen this rise of remarkable movements over the last decade. There were periods of time when I felt like, have you ever had one of those nightmares where you're trying to communicate to everybody that something bad is going on, but words won't come out of your mouth or they can't hear you or something? There was a period when I felt like that. I no longer feel lonely like that anymore. There are millions of people around the world engaged in this fight. We'll see if that's enough power to overcome the wealth and influence of the fossil fuel industry in time or not.
So talk about how you've divided your book into these 4 sections.
Sure.
The size of the board, leverage, the name of the game, and an outside chance.
The question that haunts me, and has since I wrote The End of Nature, is whether the thing that we're doing now is so large that it fundamentally alters our prospects as a civilization. Climate change is the best example of that. And climate change by now has already reached the point where, as I say in the first section, it changes the size of the board on which we're playing this game. Forever, since humans came out of Africa, we've been expanding the board on which we play the game, finding new places, spreading out. Now things are contracting. Now people are beginning to worry very much about the cities that they live that are near the coasts. Now we're seeing, perhaps you saw the story in yesterday's Times, about how climate change has become the main driver for those immigrants having to leave their homes in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, not because they want to, because there's such a deep drought that they can't grow anything there anymore. Those are the opening salvos in what's going to be a century of shrinkage. I mean, think about what we saw in California last fall. Literally, in an hour, a city called Paradise turned literally into hell. you know, everybody who watched it could imagine dying in a car, trapped in a road as they tried to get out of a forest fire. If California, the place we've always identified with a kind of golden ease, you know, is now in a paranoid sense of fear for much of the year as they look over their shoulder for the next fire, well, that's another sense in which this board has begun to shrink. The second part of the book is more political. I tried to answer for my own purposes the question of why we did so little for so long. And I think it has everything to do with the ascendant political ideology of this period, this sense that laissez-faire capitalism, that markets alone would solve problems. That happened to be the dominant political philosophy in the most important country in the world at precisely the most important moment. It's no accident that people like the Koch brothers, our biggest political players, are also oil and gas barons. I mean, they understood climate change as a threat both to their business and to their ideological worldview. Because, of course, if we're going to solve it, we're going to have to take joint action as societies to do so. The third part of the book is takes a turn into Silicon Valley and asks the question if, having ended nature, we're also on the verge of ending human nature. The same libertarian ideology, the same Ayn Rand fan club that exists in places like the Koch brothers network, exists too at the top of the heap in Silicon Valley, where everybody pays homage to the idea that they should be left alone by the government. Left alone in this case to do things like genetically engineer children, so that we had in October the first 2 designer babies born on this planet in China, but as we learned in yesterday's newspaper with help from professors at places like Stanford. That future should frighten us in all kinds of ways, that future of ever larger AI, of ever more
artificial intelligence.
Perhaps you saw the story in today's papers about how the Chinese have weaponized AI. They can now identify in any crowd, any place in China, anyone who has the facial features of a Uyghur Muslim and be able to track them by camera automatically. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of people in a country of billions of people. It's something out of a science fiction story, except it isn't. The science fiction stories are coming true.
The minority Uyghur Muslim population of China.
So the fourth part of the book asks, is it too late to do anything about this? If we wanted to, what could we do? And here I allow myself a little more hope. I've had the privilege over the last decade, since we started 350.org, of watching this climate movement arise. And it's been a great joy to see that happen and to see it join with other movements for justice, against inequality, in a kind of progressive coalition. I think there are 2 great inventions of the 20th century that might just save us in the 21st. The first was the solar panel. It's magic on a kind of Hogwarts scale, Amy. I mean, you point a sheet of glass at the sun, and out the back flows light and communications and modernity. To get to see it being installed for the first time in remote parts of Africa, say, I did a long story for the New Yorker a couple of years ago on this. It was a fantastic joy. I mean, to watch people who'd never had a cold drink in their life suddenly, because of these solar panels, able to do so, reminds us of how much we take for granted. The other invention of the 20th century that holds out real hope is this invention of nonviolent social movements. From the suffragettes, from Gandhi, from Dr. King, from people learning how to take the power of the many and the small to stand up to the mighty and the few. Climate change is perhaps the most dramatic example of this there'll ever be. I mean, as you know, we learned a lot in the last few years about the nature of the fossil fuel industry. about the fact that they knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s, knew everything and believed it. Exxon began building all its drilling rigs to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. They just didn't tell the rest of us. Instead, they devoted billions of dollars to building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that's kept us locked for 30 years in an utterly sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real, a debate that both sides knew the answer to from the start. It's just one of them was willing to lie. And so now we're at the point where we have no choice but to hope we can build movements big enough, loud enough, beautiful enough to challenge that power. That's why, for me, it's incredibly moving and incredibly exciting to see the young people doing the Green New Deal work, to see Greta Thunberg and her comrades, 12-year-olds out of school and talking articulately about these questions. I don't know if we're going to win, but we definitely are going to have a fight.
Well, we have a lot to talk about. In the next segment, Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, a global movement around climate change. His new book is called Falter: Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? What Are Wars by our very own audio engineer, Miguel Noguera. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump signed 2 executive orders last week to facilitate the approval of pipeline projects at a federal level, limiting states' ability to regulate such projects. The move's intended in part to clear the way for permitting on the Northeastern Constitution pipeline, which is stalled after New York invoked the Clean Water Act to reject the project on environmental grounds. This is President Trump speaking Wednesday in Crosby, Texas, where he signed the orders.
This order will speed up the process for approving vital infrastructure on our nation's borders, such as oil pipelines, roads, and railways. It will now take no more than 60 days. That's a vast improvement. And the president, not the bureaucracy, will have sole authority to make the final decision when we get caught up in problems.
In response last week, we spoke to Dallas Goldtooth, organizer with the Indigenous Environmental Network. I asked him to explain the pipeline executive orders signed by President Trump.
What we're seeing right now with these executive orders is nothing but an act of aggression against the authority for states to protect their homelands or protect the residents of their state and the lands within the borders of those states, mainly targeting the Clean Water Act. Really, what Trump wants to do is take away the state's abilities to enforce environmental regulations against pipeline projects or other infrastructure, fossil fuel projects, and give that power solely to the federal government. This is kind of absurd that Trump, being a representative of the figurehead of the Republican Party, is wholeheartedly endorsing an ideology that the federal government has a final say over what happens within the borders of a state, and that the state has very little recourse to address these issues. There's 2 executive orders, so that was the first one. The second one really specifically focuses on the cross-border, the border crossing of pipelines. In this regard, we're talking about Keystone XL. I know Enbridge Line 3 was also one of those pipelines that had to deal with crossing the border from Canada to transport tar sands oil. And really what the president is trying to do, and he did this a couple weeks ago by approving Keystone XL a second time, is saying that he, as the president, has the sole power to approve these projects, and is encouraging the State Department to say to act only as advisors to the president to sign these projects. And there's something really insidious and dangerous about this that is just a continuing part of Trump's legacy for overreaching his executive powers, is that the president has stated that because he is the president, he is not a federal agency, therefore he's not beholden to any environmental regulations that federal agencies have to follow. In particular, the National Environmental Protection Act, parts of the Clean Water Act. He's saying that as a president, I don't have to follow those because I'm not a federal agency. And that's very, very dangerous precedent to start here, especially as we look towards a rapid expansion of fossil fuel development in this country at this current moment, and what we're trying to fight against in the protection of Mother Earth and the sacredness of the land itself.
That's Dallas Goldtooth, Diné and Dakota organizer with the Indigenous Environmental Network. You can visit our website to see the full interview with Dallas. Still with us, Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, the global climate organization. His new book, Falter, has the human game begun to play itself out. So there you have Trump in Crosby, Texas, and you're one of the leading Indigenous activists responding. But talk about your response last week, Wednesday.
Well, first of all, it was great to see Dallas, who's one of the savviest organizers in the whole world and has done an immense amount. And I feel much the same. I mean, what Trump's trying to do is short-circuit this really effective protest movement that's been built up around pipelines. In fact, Trump had another, I got to say, I took it almost a little personally, these executive orders, because part of one of them also took aim at the divestment campaign, the fossil fuel divestment campaign.
And explain where that is now.
We started, the year after some of us started this Keystone resistance, which turned into a big resistance against pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure in general, following the lead of Indigenous people up in Alberta. The next year, a bunch of us, Naomi Klein and I and others, started this fossil fuel divestment campaign to get institutions to sell their stock. Well, it worked better than we thought it would. It's become, by some measures, the largest anti-corporate campaign of its kind ever. I think we're now at $8 trillion worth of endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole. And it's really beginning to take a toll on the industry. Earlier this year, Shell said in its annual report that divestment had become a material risk to its business. A couple of weeks ago, the heads of many of the biggest coal firms in the world were at a Houston Energy Conference, and they were quoted by Politico as explaining that they just could not find capital anymore for new coal projects. Too many funds had divested. People had been scared off. That's why Trump's trying to push back on that and on pipelines. I think in so doing, he's done us, in a sense, a favor. I mean, it's pretty much like he's providing the blueprints to the climate Death Star, and saying, here are the couple of places you might want to push really hard because it clearly hurts.
Well, tell me if you think this will add to that movement. President Trump coming under fire earlier this month for falsely claiming windmills cause cancer. He made the remarks in a speech to the National Republican Congressional Committee where he touted U.S. oil and gas drilling while mocking renewable energy.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations. Your house just went down 75% in value. And they say the noise causes cancer. You told me that one, okay?
Whew. Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley called Trump's remark idiotic, saying, quote, I wish his staff would tell him I'm the father and now the grandfather of wind energy tax credits.
Look, Trump is obviously a ludicrous buffoon in almost every situation, but never more so than here. His dislike of windmills dates to his desire for a Scottish golf course where no golfer would have to see one in the distance. But the reason that Grassley is standing up for this is because places like Iowa now make a ton of money off the wind. It's not like anyone's going to defeat these technologies. Wind and sun are free. That's why they're coming so fast. What the fossil fuel industry, with Trump as one of its Helpers wants to do is slow that transition down, stretch it out so that their current business model can last a couple more decades. The problem with that is that if we don't get action really soon, if we let it stretch out, those are the decades that will finish the work of breaking the planet. It's why the urgency of something like the Green New Deal is so crucial.
On Sunday, the Seychelles President Danny Faure visited a British-led science expedition exploring the depths of the Indian Ocean. From there, he gave an impassioned speech on climate change inside a manned underwater submersible 400 feet below the ocean's surface.
The ocean is huge, covering almost 70% of our planet. But we have managed to seriously impact this vast environment through climate change. Ocean acidification, overfishing, plastic, and other pollution and other threats. From this depth, I can see the incredible wildlife that needs our protection and the consequences of damaging this huge ecosystem that has existed for millennia. We must act accordingly. This issue is bigger than all of us, and we cannot wait for the next generation to solve it. We are running out of excuses to not take action and running out of time.
That's Seychelles President Danny Faure again, speaking 400 feet below the Indian Ocean's surface. Bill.
It reminds me so much of watching Mohammed Nasheed from the Maldives take his whole cabinet down in scuba gear for a cabinet meeting to send the UN a decade ago a message that we had to get back to 350 parts per million. It is now, at this point, the leadership of those most vulnerable states, the low-lying island states, places like Bangladesh, they are, I mean, the hair on fire is much too subtle an understatement. They understand that the absolute survival of the places where they live and the oceans around them is now at stake. You'd say they were the canaries in the coal mine if it wasn't such a horrible metaphor at this point. They're on the cutting edge, and remember that it's their citizens who are really on the forefront of this movement everywhere. I dedicate this new book to our colleague Kareti Tiamalu in Fiji, who was one of the greatest activists we ever met, the Pacific Climate Warriors.
Going from them and from the Seychelles president to 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist who's inspired this global student strike. She was speaking just a few weeks ago for a call for more action on climate. This is Greta recently addressing a rally in Berlin.
The older generations have failed tackling the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. When we say to them that we are worried about the future of our civilization, they just pat on our heads saying everything will be fine, don't worry. But we should worry, we should panic. And by panic, I don't mean running around screaming. By panic, I mean stepping out of our comfort zones.
So that's Greta Thunberg. She was speaking in Berlin when she first did her vigil alone for 3 weeks in front of the Swedish parliament, and MPs were saying to her, go to school. She said, we have done our homework, and that's why I'm here.
She's an amazing force. I mean, her basic point is if governments can't be bothered to prepare the world for climate change, it's a little rich to demand that I sit in school all day preparing myself for the future. And it's a message that's amplified and resonated. There were millions of school children out on March 15th, and now it's time for adults to heed the call. Those kids were saying in one rally after another, we need adults backing us up. Watch over the next few months as people try to organize the adult equivalent of those strikes, getting people out of their businesses for a day at a time. Because if you think about it, I mean, they're disrupting education as usual. We need to disrupt business as usual because it's business as usual, literally, that's doing us in. It's the fact that we just keep going on, doing what we're doing, not changing in any dramatic way at a moment when the world demands transformation.
People are more active than they've ever been on climate change. Talk about the change and understanding across the political spectrum in this country. This country is so important because it's historically the greatest greenhouse gas emitter. But also, you say, look at people and look at me here with my computer in my hand, an extension of the human body.
Look, we're in a climate moment now, okay? That's good news. The IPCC report last fall that gave us 10 years to make a change, the fires in California, the rise of the Green New Deal. Somehow these things have finally captured people's attention. So as we enter, say, this presidential cycle, as you know, we used to fret and complain because they never had asked a question at any presidential debate about climate change. Well, I'm not worried about that going forward. That's going to be one of, if not the biggest question. Candidate after candidate, as they announce for president, are saying this is the most important issue that we face. Buttigieg said it yesterday in South Bend. That's really important. The question now is, can we commit people to moving quickly enough? This is one of these places where I have to kind of restrain myself from saying, oh, if only you'd listened to me when, because 30 years ago, there were things we could do that weren't very hard. If we'd made some fairly small adjustments, put a price on carbon, say, or something, we'd be on a very different trajectory now. Having let the fossil fuel industry delay action for 3 decades, we're now at the point where everything's hard, and it's going to be, for even the bravest politicians, a real stretch.
And you talk about this being a climate moment. It's an everything moment for 2020. And you see this in the Democrats, for example, close to 20 now who are running for president. Yeah. You have Jay Inslee of Washington State, the governor, running, saying climate change is his only issue.
What's interesting this time is and you know, the way that we're thinking about it at 350 Action, and I think a lot of environmentalists are thinking about it, is we actually need all 20 of them to be climate candidates. What we're playing for now is less a set of policies, though the Green New Deal is the set of policies that we're going to need, but what we're playing for most of all is a change in the zeitgeist, a sense of what's natural and obvious and normal going forward. And if we can get that change, then the legislation will follow rather easily. The point is getting that across, taking us from the place where we weren't paying attention to climate to the place where we're understanding that it is the issue of our time.
When we talk about it as the issue, it's part and parcel with the inequality in this country, the power of these economic giants. You have, for example, Chase, Seattle activists recently rallying against Chase Bank's alleged of their investments in fossil fuels.
They shut down 44 branches last week.
And then talk about J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, their response to all of this.
So the financial community, we really need them to step up. Most of them have issued reports announcing that they care about climate change, but they keep the money spigot open for the fossil fuel industry. That's why people are able to build pipelines, because people keep lending them money. And so increasingly, there's pressure on the banking sector, and the other place where you're going to see more and more of it is pressure on the insurance sector. They have more money than anybody, and they should know better. They're the ones with the actuarial tables demonstrating just what hot water we're in, and yet they continue to lend money to the fossil fuel industry too. The pressure on these guys to stop and change their ways is only going to grow more intense. Look, this whole complex of the fossil fuel industry and the financiers who back them, they're the Philip Morris of today. The only difference is, you know, where Philip Morris took us out one smoker at a time, Exxon's figuring out how to take us out one planet at a time. And that's why the resistance is growing more vocal. angrier.
And finally, the Green New Deal, this paradigm-shattering approach that McConnell tried to humiliate the whole idea of by taking a vote at this moment, when even those who supported it didn't want this to happen. The power of this new Congress, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and what the Green New Deal means to you.
Well, partly it's great personal appreciation because the kids who are doing it, this Sunrise Movement, which is a wonderful outfit, an awful lot of them, maybe most of them, cut their teeth on college campuses as part of this divestment movement. And it's a reminder of how movements grow. But now they've introduced this legislation that is the first time we've had an answer to climate change that's on the same scale as the problem itself. That's why it's important. It gets the scale right, and it understands that at this point we have to address it alongside inequality, alongside the economic insecurity that people suffer from. That this is an enormous crisis, but also an opportunity to remake not just a broken planet, but a broken society.
Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, his new book, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? We'll do part 2 of this discussion and really look at artificial intelligence and why that is so significant to him, the threat he is talking about. And we're going to post online at DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, we'll speak with investigative reporter Alan Nairn in Indonesia on the elections that are taking place there and what he has discovered about one of the leading presidential candidates, Prabowo, his plans to make mass arrests of political opponents. Stay with us. Guardians of the Land by Northern Voice. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Indonesia ahead of Wednesday's national presidential elections, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim nation, third largest democracy in the world behind India and the United States. Indonesian President Joko Widodo, better known as Jokowi, is up for re-election Wednesday. His chief rival, Prabowo Subianto, a former Special Forces military commander, the former son-in-law of Indonesia's longtime dictator Suharto. It's a rematch of the 2014 election that Jokowi won by almost 6 percentage points. Investigative journalist Alan Nairn has just uncovered shocking plans made by Prabowo for if he wins the presidency. According to minutes of a campaign strategy session obtained by Alan Nairn, Prabowo has made plans to stage mass arrests of political opponents as well as his current allies. Nairn reports Prabowo also wants to restore Indonesia's army to the role it played in the U.S.-backed Suharto dictatorship, which lasted from 1967 to 1998. Alan Nairn now joins us from Indonesia. He's just published his latest report on his website, alannairn.org. Alan, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of this election on Wednesday and what you've just uncovered.
Thanks. Good to be with you. The General Prabowo, who has a real chance to be elected president, is the single most notorious massacre general in Indonesia. He has been associated with more mass killings of civilians than any other officer. He is also the officer who was the closest protege of the U.S. government, working directly during his career with the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency and U.S. Special Forces. He told me this in 2001 when we had two long discussions between adversaries. His statements about how he brought in U.S. troops into Indonesia and how they used the opportunity in Indonesia to do what he called recon for the invasion contingency. Namely, they used the chance that Prabowo gave them to make contingency plans for a theoretical potential U.S. invasion of Indonesia in the future. That claim of his was backed up by Pentagon documents. And Prabowo said to me, I was the Americans' fair-haired boy. He was Washington's man in Jakarta for decades. But after General Suharto, who had consolidated his power by massacring anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million civilians with direct U.S. support, after Suharto was finally ousted in a democratic uprising in '98, General Prabowo was no longer useful to Washington, and they just dumped him overnight after he lost an internal power struggle with another general. Now, Prabowo, who has been associated with at least 2 coup attempts, and who told me when I spoke to him years ago that Indonesia was not ready for democracy, and that he dreamed about seizing power and being called a fascist dictator. He now has a real chance to win the presidency. And in the report I put out today, I referred to the minutes of a meeting which took place at one of Prabowo's homes in Jakarta on December 21st of last year. This was a meeting with Prabowo, 6 other generals, several admirals, and 3 of his civilian operatives, at least those that were named in the minutes, which leaked out through the aparat, the military, police, and intelligence system of Indonesia. According to that, they made specific plans for what they would do if Prabowo assumed power. One of them was to stage mass arrests of political opponents, and they specified the political parties that were anti-Prabowo that would be targeted. A second, though, was more novel, that they would also do mass arrests of allies of Prabowo. There seemed to be 2 motivations. One, to consolidate power in Prabowo's own hands, to eliminate rivals, to eliminate other leaders, both in the opposition and in the camp that now supports him. To be targeted for arrest, according to these minutes, were the Democrat Party of former President General Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and also the Islamist forces, ranging from the political party PKS to the FPI, the remnants of HTI, Islamist militia groups, and other kinds of mass organizations. These groups will also be targeted for arrest. This in accord with the second motivation, which was to curry favor with the United States. According to these minutes and to discussions I've had with people from the Prabowo circle in verifying this document and the material for this article, Prabowo is very eager to get back in the good graces of Washington. And so he's actually seriously talking about arresting these Islamist groups that are now the driving force of his campaign. On the ground, they are the ones that are giving it energy, that are giving it organizational structure, and in my opinion, are giving him a real chance to win on Wednesday and defeat President Jokowi, the civilian incumbent. So what they're talking about is a political night of the long knives, where both opponents and allies from outside Prabowo's own party would be cast aside, eliminated, locked up. In order to do this, they talked about deploying the Attorney General of Prabowo's new Attorney General his new chief of the National Police, the ostensibly independent Corruption Eradication Commission, and also been the National Intelligence Agency, which has a the state intelligence body, which has a liaison relationship with the CIA, and which sometimes does assassinations. And in fact, is perhaps best known for its arsenic assassination in 2004 of the great human rights hero Munir, who was a friend of mine. Also, in this meeting, according to the minutes and my discussions with people who are familiar with it, they also talked about restoring the Indonesian army to the role it played during the New Order Suharto dictatorship. This was the time of the mass slaughter, and a time when the army was the ultimate arbiter of politics, even down to the neighborhood and village level. So if General Prabowo wins this election, and he has a real chance, the consequences would be very severe for the chance of any future organizing, activism, or movement toward anything resembling a real democracy in Indonesia. And there's a great irony here, because if this does turn out to be a close election, as I believe it will, there's a chance that it's the very victims of General Prabowo and their families, their descendants, the descendants of their families, and those who admire the brave struggle of many of these victims. They could be the ones who end up giving Prabowo the victory, because President Jokowi, who defeated Prabowo the last time around in 2014, has disappointed the activist community. He said he would bring many of these generals, mass murdering generals, to trial. He didn't. He's clearly afraid of the army. He has brought some of these generals, like Hendro Priyono and Wiranto, into his circle to, according to his theory, protect him from the rest of the army, which he doesn't really have control over. And so, in their disappointment, many activists are talking about golput, essentially abstaining from voting. And there are indications that this golput vote or non-vote could be rather significant. And if it's close, it could put Prabowo over the top. There is some...
Alan, if you could, in the last minute, talk about the role of Freeport-McMoRan, one of the largest gas and one of the largest gold and copper mining operations in the world, based here in the United States.
Yes, they operate in West Papua, which is de facto occupied by the security forces of Indonesia. They've stripped the mountains, spoiled the streams, done billions of dollars in environmental damage. General Prabowo, in his campaign, rails against foreigners, rails against foreign corporations and the extraction of Indonesia's wealth. But in fact, privately, Prabowo intervened to help Freeport-McMoRan, according to the vice chairman of his own political party, who told me how Prabowo intervened to kill a workers' rights lawsuit against Freeport. And in terms of the election, I would say, nurut saya jangan golput. Use the vote. This election could prove to be a turning point for Indonesia.
Alan Nairn, I want to thank you for being with us, activist, award-winning investigative journalist. To see his coverage of Indonesia, go to DemocracyNow.org. Speaking to us from Jakarta, Indonesia, ahead of Indonesia's Wednesday elections. Indonesia, the largest Muslim population in the world. Alan has been reporting from there for decades. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura, Tamari Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone, Vesta Godars, and Carl Marxer, and John Randolph, Karen Meadows, Anna Osbeck, and Matt Ely. If you'd like to see part 2 of our discussion with Bill McKibben, author of Falter, go to democracynow.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter by sending the word Democracy Now! To 66866. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.